When I first met Michael Turner, I believed I had finally found someone who understood me in a way no one else ever had. By then, I was 33 years old, working as a senior financial consultant in Chicago. My life was organized, steady, and by most people's standards, successful. Yet I often felt the hollowness of my own achievements. I had spent so many years pouring my time and energy into late-night meetings, client deadlines, and a firm that demanded everything I could give. My apartment downtown overlooked the skyline, but most nights I hardly noticed the view. It felt more like a cage of glass and steel than a sanctuary. My career had rewarded me with a savings account of nearly $480,000, money I had earned through sacrifice, endless overtime, and a refusal to let anyone outwork me. But no one applauded the long nights I sat alone at my desk, staring at spreadsheets while others were out living their lives. Success without companionship is a strange thing. It feeds your pride but starves your soul. When Michael walked into my life, it was as though I was being offered a chance to breathe again. He wasn't flashy, not the kind of man who tried to impress with expensive suits or rehearsed charm. He worked in real estate, managing mid-sized commercial properties across the Midwest, and he spoke about his work with quiet confidence. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a smile that seemed to disarm the room. What drew me in most was his ability to listen. He didn't interrupt, didn't make me feel like my career intimidated him. For once, I felt seen not as a woman with money, but as a woman with a heart. Our courtship was swift but steady. We spent weekends in restaurants tucked away in Chicago's older neighborhoods, places with creaking wooden floors and wine lists that only locals knew about. He introduced me to his parents in Charleston, South Carolina within 6 months, and though I found them reserved, I told myself they were simply cautious about outsiders. His mother, Lorraine, had a soft southern drawl that reminded me of evenings on wraparound porches, and his father, Douglas, was a retired contractor with strong opinions about politics and local businesses. Michael and I were married in Savannah, Georgia, in a modest ceremony that cost about $32,000. I covered the majority of the expenses without much thought. It felt natural. I had more financial stability, and I believed marriage was about pooling resources. I never saw the imbalance as dangerous at the time. I was blinded by the glow of what I thought was love. After our wedding, we moved temporarily into his parents' 2-story brick house on Willow Street in Charleston. The home had charm. Ivy climbing the sides, wide porches, and hardwood floors that told stories with every creak. Lorraine often reminded me how lucky Michael was to have found a hardworking woman like me. The words sounded sweet on the surface, but sometimes there was a sharpness behind them, as though she was measuring my worth in terms of what I could provide. Still, I brushed it aside. I wanted to belong, and belonging meant forgiving small cuts. At first, life felt almost idyllic. Sundays were reserved for family dinners. Lorraine would prepare casseroles and sweet tea, and Douglas would share long tales of his contracting days. I remember sitting in their backyard garden one afternoon, watching the sunlight fall across rows of azaleas, and thinking that maybe I had finally found what I had been missing. I had been so focused on independence that I had almost forgotten what family felt like. But slowly, whispers of renovation projects began to creep into our conversations. Michael's parents would talk about how the house was outdated, how modern buyers wanted open floor plans, new plumbing, and granite countertops. Lorraine insisted that if the house were updated, it could sell for nearly $900,000, enough to secure their retirement. Michael echoed their optimism, telling me it was only a matter of lending a hand until the property sold. One evening, as we sat in the dining room, Michael leaned across the table and explained that his parents needed help covering the first phase of renovations. "It's just temporary," he assured me. "Once the house sells, we'll pay everything back. Think of it as an investment in family." His words carried the weight of love and loyalty, and I wanted desperately to prove that I was committed not only to him, but to the people who had raised him. I remember sitting in my office that week, staring at the numbers in my account. $480,000. I had worked for every cent, saving instead of indulging, building a future I believed was mine. And yet, when I signed the check for $85,000 to cover new roofing and structural repairs, my hand didn't tremble. I told myself this was the start of weaving my life with theirs, I was investing in more than a house. I was investing in trust. The contractors arrived within days, hammering and sawing from morning until late evening. Michael praised me constantly, telling me I had saved his parents from financial ruin. Lorraine hugged me, tears glistening in her eyes, calling me her blessing. Douglas nodded with approval, though his pride never let him say much directly. For a brief moment I felt needed. It was intoxicating. Yet beneath the surface of gratitude, a subtle shift began. Whenever bills arrived, they seemed to find their way to me. Lorraine would sigh dramatically over rising utility costs. Douglas would mention the burden of unexpected expenses. Michael would gently place the envelopes on my desk, his tone casual, as though I was the natural one to solve them. At first, I convinced myself it was temporary, that repayment was around the corner once the house was listed. Still, there were small cracks in their promises. Lorraine would mention additional projects, a new kitchen island, updated windows, landscaping upgrades, that weren't part of the original plan. Michael encouraged me to see it as increasing the home's value. "It's smart," he would say. "We'll make even more when it sells." His confidence was persuasive, and my silence became complicity. Looking back, I realized that moment, the signing of that first check, was the turning point. It wasn't just money leaving my account. It was the beginning of a slow unraveling of trust. But at the time, I didn't see it. I only saw family, hope, and the possibility of finally belonging to something larger than myself. The irony was not lost on me later. In my career, I was known as the woman who could spot financial traps a mile away. I had saved clients from bad investments worth millions of dollars. Yet when it came to my own life, my own heart, I had ignored every warning sign. That first investment of $85,000 was meant to secure love and loyalty. Instead, it was the first thread pulled from a tapestry I thought was unshakable. I didn't know it then, but I was financing not just a house renovation. I was financing my own awakening. And though the walls of the Willow Street house stood taller with each improvement, the foundation of my trust in Michael and his family was quietly beginning to crack. Within months of signing that first check, I realized Michael's parents were not simply struggling with an old house in need of repairs. Their lives were tangled in debts far deeper than anyone had admitted to me. Lorraine, despite her soft manner and gentle words, had been carrying balances on multiple credit cards, all maxed out, with interest rates so high they practically guaranteed she would never escape them. Douglas, proud and stubborn, had taken out loans totaling nearly $220,000, most of which he had poured into a failed construction venture with an old friend. I discovered all of this gradually, almost by accident, as I noticed envelopes tucked into drawers and statements left carelessly on counters. At first I thought I had misunderstood, but the more I pieced together, the clearer it became. They weren't managing a temporary setback. They were drowning. It would have been reasonable, wise even, for me to confront Michael immediately. After all, marriage is meant to be a partnership. But reason often bends under the weight of loyalty and hope. I convinced myself that silence was the smarter path. To question too much, too soon, would make me appear mistrustful. Instead of pressing for answers, I doubled down on my role as the fixer. When the plumbing failed and water stains appeared across the dining room ceiling, Douglas looked helpless, as though the house itself had turned against him. Michael asked if I could step in, just for the time being, until they could refinance or sell. The words sounded familiar. Always temporary. Always repayment around the corner. And so I wrote another check. This time, it was for $56,000, paid directly to the contractors who replaced pipes and repaired drywall. A few months later, the electrical system needed upgrading. Then the interior walls needed fresh paint, and the hardwood floors cried out for sanding and polishing. By the end of that cycle, I had poured an additional $140,000 into the house. Each time, I told myself I was protecting an investment, ensuring that the property would fetch a high price when it finally went on the market. But another part of me knew the truth. I was avoiding confrontation. I was paying for peace, believing that if I just covered the shortfall, harmony would return. Michael's behavior made that illusion harder to sustain. While I juggled numbers, invoices, and legal documents, he seemed to drift further away from responsibility. He claimed to be networking, traveling often to Atlanta to meet potential investors for his real estate ventures. But the trips began to feel suspicious. He would return with vague stories, no contracts, no visible signs of progress. When I pressed for details, he would brush me off with a charming smile and a kiss on the forehead, as if I were an impatient child. Meanwhile, Lorraine's gratitude became a kind of performance. She would hug me, thank me for saving them yet again, and call me the guardian angel of this family. But I noticed how quickly her words of praise shifted into new requests. Each thank you was followed by a suggestion for another improvement, another necessity, another opportunity to increase the home's value. It was as if my generosity had opened a faucet they no longer felt the need to close. At night, when everyone else slept, I sat in the small office I had carved out of a corner of the Charleston house. I spread receipts, contracts, and bank statements across the desk, cataloging every cent I had spent. I created folders, spreadsheets, and timelines. My work brain, the part of me that had built a career protecting clients from financial ruin, was fully awake, fully aware of the trap tightening around me. And yet I said nothing. Outwardly, I was the supportive wife. Inwardly, I was the quiet accountant, building a ledger of every betrayal. It was during one of these midnight sessions that I decided I needed professional advice. I called a former colleague in Boston, a man named Richard Bell, who had transitioned from finance into law. He specialized in asset protection and property rights, and I trusted his discretion. I told him everything: the checks, the renovations, the debts, the promises that repayment was always just around the corner. He listened without judgment, then said words that chilled me. If you don't secure your stake in that house, you're going to lose every dime. They'll bleed you dry. Richard advised me to transfer ownership of the Charleston property into my name as collateral for the money I had invested. He explained how it could be done legally, through contracts that would appear routine to anyone not looking too closely. The process would cost me about $20,000 in legal fees and filings. To me, it was a small price compared to what I had already given, so I followed his advice. Quietly, carefully, I moved the pieces into place. I had Michael and his parents sign papers they barely read, trusting me to handle the details since I had always managed the finances. They signed without hesitation, not realizing they were signing away control of the house. Within a few months, the deed listed me as the sole owner. It was a strange kind of victory, one that I couldn't celebrate out loud. They never noticed. Why would they? I was the one writing the checks, paying the bills, managing the contractors. To them, I was the safety net, the dependable one who ensured the lights stayed on and the roof stayed secure. To me, I had become something different. A woman living two lives. One was visible, obedient, generous. The other was silent, calculating and increasingly aware of just how precarious my marriage had become. Michael, in his distance, seemed almost relieved to let me shoulder the burden. He would pat my hand and say, "You're amazing, you know." That? I don't know how we'd survive without you. The words, once flattering, began to sound like chains. I wasn't being admired. I was being used. By the end of that year, I had invested nearly half of my savings into a house that wasn't even mine on paper, at least not in the eyes of the family. Only I knew the truth. I held the deed. I held the receipts. I held the evidence. But holding all of it in secret came with a price. The weight was immense, pressing on my chest during quiet mornings and heavy nights. I had no one to confide in, no outlet for the gnawing suspicion that I was being played. Outwardly, I smiled at family dinners, listened to Lorraine's endless lists of desired improvements, and supported Michael when he claimed his ventures would soon take off. Inwardly, I kept my silence, waiting for the moment when the truth would matter. That moment hadn't yet come, but I knew it was approaching. You can only carry a burden for so long before it demands to be set down. And so, while the house on Willow Street grew more polished with each renovation, I sat in the shadows, watching the cracks in trust deepen, telling myself that patience was my sharpest weapon. The moment everything unraveled began innocently enough on a soft spring evening in Charlotte. I had traveled there for a client meeting, my day filled with spreadsheets, contract reviews, and polite smiles in conference rooms. Afterward, I decided to treat myself to dinner at a small bistro on Tryon Street, a place I had visited before, with colleagues. I had just settled into my seat near the window when I saw a familiar figure stepping onto the sidewalk across the street. It was Michael, my husband. He wasn't supposed to be in Charlotte. He had told me he was in Atlanta, meeting a business partner about a potential office building deal. My breath caught as I leaned closer to the glass, my mind racing to convince itself that I had made a mistake. But there was no mistake. Michael's walk was distinct, confident, the same stride I had memorized during years of watching him move through rooms. And then she appeared. A woman in a fitted blazer and heels, younger than me by at least a decade. She looped her arm through his, laughing in a way that made her head tilt back. Michael looked down at her with an expression I hadn't seen directed at me in years, open, unguarded, almost tender. They paused at the entrance of an upscale restaurant, and he placed his hand on the small of her back as though guiding her into his world. My stomach twisted. I knew that touch, that easy charm. My fork clattered against the plate as my hand trembled. I couldn't take my eyes off them. For the first time, all the quiet doubts and late-night suspicions came together like pieces of a cruel puzzle. This wasn't business. This wasn't networking. This was betrayal, standing before me in the flesh. Her name, I would later learn, was Vanessa Hayes, a rising real estate agent who flaunted her connections with wealthy European investors. She was ambitious, flashy, and everything Michael's parents admired in a woman. Unlike me, she didn't carry the quiet burden of financial responsibility. She was free to dazzle, to entertain, to live without restraint. And Michael, ever the opportunist, had chosen her as his escape. When I confronted him days later after he returned to Charleston, the mask he had worn for so long finally slipped. I waited until we were alone in the Willow Street house, the evening sun casting long shadows across the living room. My voice shook only slightly as I asked, "Who is Vanessa?" For a heartbeat, I saw panic flicker in his eyes, but instead of remorse, instead of scrambling for excuses, he smirked. "You've been spying on me?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery. I stood my ground. "I saw you. I saw you with her." He sighed, as though I were a child who had misunderstood something simple. "You don't get it, do you? You're just the wallet of this family. That's all you've ever been." The words landed like a blow to the chest. I felt my breath leave me, not because I hadn't suspected it, but because hearing it spoken aloud stripped away every fragile hope I had been clinging to. He didn't love me. He never had. To him, I was a source of funding, a convenient solution to his family's endless problems. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. Instead, I let silence wrap itself around me like armor. In that moment, I realized anger would give him too much satisfaction. My quiet was more powerful than any outburst. That night, while he slept upstairs, I returned to my office corner and opened the files I had been keeping for months. Receipts, contracts, loan statements, all meticulously cataloged. I had already secured ownership of the Willow Street house, but now I pushed further. With Richard's help in Boston, I had begun purchasing the debts Douglas and Lorraine had accrued. They had borrowed heavily from local banks, assuming their names and history would be enough to keep creditors patient. What they didn't know was that those debts now belonged to me. Piece by piece, I had bought them out. By spring, I wasn't just their benefactor. I was their creditor. And with Michael's betrayal laid bare, I no longer felt the need to hide my hand. I filed for divorce the following week. Richard drafted the papers with an efficiency that left me both grateful and stunned. The court filings listed not only Michael's infidelity, but also detailed the financial entanglements I had untangled on my own. When I slid the documents across the kitchen table to him, he barely looked at them before his face drained of color. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, flipping through the pages. "It's the truth," I said evenly. "I own this house. I own your parents' debts. And soon, I'll own my freedom." Lorraine found out the same evening. She stormed into the kitchen, tears streaking her cheeks, clutching the papers Michael had thrown at her. "How could you do this to us?" she wailed. "We trusted you." I looked at her with a calmness I didn't know I possessed. "You trusted me to pay your bills, Lorraine. You trusted me to keep quiet while you drained me dry. That trust has limits. You crossed them." Douglas said nothing. He stood in the doorway, his jaw clenched, his pride too bruised to form words. For once, his silence wasn't a weapon. It was a confession. Michael raged, of course. He shouted about betrayal, about how I had ruined everything. But his fury only revealed how powerless he truly was. The court order gave them 30 days to vacate the Charleston house. It was no longer theirs to occupy. It was mine, legally and indisputably. In those weeks, the atmosphere in the house was thick with bitterness. Lorraine avoided me, retreating into her bedroom. Douglas spent long hours outside, smoking on the porch. Michael oscillated between pleading and threatening, as though either tactic could sway me. But I remained unmoved. My silence had become my sharpest weapon. Every time he tried to provoke me, I simply walked away, letting the weight of my indifference crush him more than anger ever could. When the moving trucks finally arrived, I stood on the porch and watched as they carried out furniture, boxes, and the remnants of a life I had once tried to share. Lorraine wept openly, clinging to framed photos and old quilts. Douglas barked orders, trying to maintain control even as his authority crumbled. Michael avoided my eyes, his pride too fractured to face the woman he had underestimated. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I simply observed, storing the horror moment in my memory as proof that patience and strategy could outlast manipulation. By the end of that day, the house on Willow Street was mine alone. Empty, quiet, echoing with the ghosts of deceit. I walked through each room, touching the walls. I had paid to restore, the floors I had paid to polish, the fixtures I had paid to install. What had once been a prison of obligations had transformed into a monument of survival. But I knew it was only the beginning. The house, the debts, the divorce. All of it was just the foundation for the life I would build next. Michael and his family had taken my trust, my money, and my time. But I had taken back something far greater: control. And as I closed the front door that night, locking it for the first time as its true owner, I realized the deepest betrayal was no longer theirs. It would have been a betrayal of myself if I had stayed silent forever. By choosing to act, I had reclaimed not only my home but my dignity. The house on Willow Street was silent the day the moving trucks pulled away for good. Dust floated in the late afternoon sunlight as I walked through the empty rooms, the hardwood floors echoing beneath my steps. Every corner carried memories, but none that I wanted to keep. The house had once represented belonging, then sacrifice, and finally, betrayal. Now it was nothing more than an asset, a property I had wrestled back from those who had tried to strip me of everything. It didn't take long for me to decide what to do next. I contacted a realtor in Charleston, a sharp, woman named Grace Holloway who understood the market well. Together, we toured the property, evaluating the renovations I had poured into it. The new roof gleamed, the plumbing ran flawlessly, the floors shone like mirrors. "You could easily get $1.2 million for this," Grace said, tapping her pen against the kitchen counter. "The location alone makes it prime, and the work you've done, it's move-in ready." Hearing those words brought me a strange mix of relief and fury. Relief because I knew the sacrifices I had made weren't entirely wasted. Fury because I remembered how close I had come to losing every cent to people who never valued me beyond what I could provide. Still, I nodded calmly. "List it," I told her. "I want it gone." The house sold within weeks. A young couple from New York, eager to relocate to the South, snapped it up at full price, $1.2 million. After paying off the last legal fees and small remaining obligations, I walked away with nearly $600,000 in clear profit. It was more than money. It was vindication. Every sleepless night, every quiet sacrifice, every check I had written in the shadows, all of it had led to this moment. The money was mine, earned not through manipulation or deceit, but through patience, strategy, and unyielding resolve. I used a portion of the profit to buy myself a townhouse in Savannah, Georgia. It wasn't grand, not compared to the sprawling Charleston house, but it was mine alone. Nestled on a cobblestone street lined with oak trees dripping with Spanish moss, the townhouse overlooked the river. From my window, I could watch boats drift lazily past, their reflections shimmering on the water. The air smelled of salt and jasmine, and every morning I felt the quiet strength of a city that had rebuilt itself countless times through history. Savannah became my symbol of resilience, my reminder that I too could rise from ruin. With the rest of my money, I finally pursued what I had always dreamed of: independence. I invested $250,000 into founding my own consulting firm. No more. Working for companies that demanded endless hours and gave little in return. No more tying my worth to men who saw me as a resource instead of a partner. I rented an office downtown, decorated it with soft, neutral tones and tall bookshelves, and built a team of 3 assistants who shared my vision. Clients came quickly, small businesses at first, then larger firms from both America and Europe. Word spread of my reputation for precision and integrity, and soon my calendar was filled with projects that excited me. For the first time, I worked for myself, not for anyone else's approval. The freedom was intoxicating. Every contract I signed felt like a declaration. I am no longer defined by what others take from me, but by what I create for myself. Meanwhile, Michael faded into the background of my life. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard whispers of his downfall. After our divorce was finalized, he tried to reinvent himself with Vanessa, parading her around as though she were the answer to all his problems. But investors are not blind, and charm without substance only lasts so long. Deals fell through, debts mounted. Eventually, he left Charleston altogether, chasing new illusions in Florida. I didn't bother to keep track beyond the occasional rumor. He had become irrelevant, a ghost of a chapter I had already closed. Lorraine and Douglas were no better off. The debts I had acquired from them were real, and though I had no intention of squeezing them dry, the weight of owing them became a punishment in itself. They had underestimated me, believing I would always stay silent. In the end, my silence had become their undoing. I didn't need to scream or fight. I only needed to wait. Looking back, I realized that the greatest transformation had not been in my bank account or career, but in myself. For years, I believed strength meant sacrifice, that proving my worth required me to endure quietly, to give until I was empty. But true strength, I learned, comes from knowing when to stop giving. It comes from recognizing manipulation for what it is and choosing to value yourself above the illusions others sell you. In the quiet of my Savannah townhouse, I often sat by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the river and reflecting on the woman I had become. I thought about the girl who once worked late nights in Chicago, hoarding money as a shield against loneliness. I thought about the wife who signed checks in Charleston, believing she was buying love and belonging. And I thought about the woman I had become, the woman who owned her choices, her finances, and her freedom. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it waits. Sometimes it sits in silence, gathering evidence, planning carefully, and striking only when the moment is right. My journey had proven that patience and strategy could dismantle even the most elaborate schemes. I didn't just survive betrayal, I transformed it into my greatest victory. Now, when I walk the cobblestone streets of Savannah, I carry myself differently. My shoulders are no longer weighed down by invisible debts. My steps are lighter, my voice steadier. I no longer seek validation in the eyes of others. My worth is not measured in the gifts I give or the sacrifices I make, but in the life I have, built for myself. And every time I look out at the river, I smile, knowing the truth that took me so long to learn. Freedom isn't given, it's claimed. And once you claim it, no one can take it from you.